All right, everybody, how's it going out there? Welcome to the Otherppl Show. My name is Brad Listi, and I'm in Los Angeles. It's good to be with you. Hope it's going okay. Hope you're, dealing with whatever you're dealing with and dealing with what we're all dealing with. My guest today is Katie Kitamura. Her new novel is called Audition, and it's available from Riverhead Books. Audition is a genre-bending novel, and the third in what you might refer to as a loose trilogy. Audition was preceded by the novels A Separation and Intimacies, and it continues Katie Kitamura's thematic exploration of identity and interpretation and passivity. It's a novel about an actress and her husband and another young man whose identity is a bit of a mystery. I'll put it that way. This is a deft and destabilizing novel that reads as both a family story and a kind of psychological thriller. And you will hear all about it in my conversation with Katie Kitamura. That is coming up in just a bit. Today's episode is brought to you by Mulholland Books, publisher of the novel Buzzkill by J. Robert Lannan. Buzzkill is the official May pick of my book club, the Otherppl Book Club. You should sign up for the Otherppl Book Club. Get a new book delivered to your door every 30 days. I interview book club authors right here on the program, so you can read and then listen, or listen and then read, or listen while reading. It's up to you. You can sign up for the book club over at the show's official website, otherppl.com. And what can I tell you about Buzzkill? It's about two sisters who are private investigators. They are named Jane and Lila Poole, and they are plunged in this novel into the recesses of an underground drug operation with links to a burgeoning fascist movement. It all begins when they get some shocking news about their Aunt Ruth, who died of suicide more than a decade earlier, but it turns out that Aunt Ruth's death might not have been what it seemed. Buzzkill is a thrilling and kinetic novel that shows J. Robert Lannan at the height of his powers. Once again, it's called Buzzkill, available now from Mulholland Books. So a quick plug for my email newsletter. I have one too. Everybody's got one. You can sign up for mine over at bradlisti.substack.com. I will email you once a week, most likely. I will let you know about the latest episodes of this show, and I will share a list of links to things that I've been reading and finding interesting. It's that simple. It's painless. You can subscribe over at Substack if you want to get my newsletter. I also want to give a quick plug to my new company, which will be launching later this year. You've heard me talking about it if you're a regular listener of this program. The company is called Deep Dive, and it specializes in the creation of long-form educational audio. And the debut course from Deep Dive is called How to Write a Novel. I am the host of the course, and it will feature more than 50 hours of never-before-heard conversations with dozens of today's leading writers, including Emily St. John Mandel, Steve Almond, Matt Bell, Poor Chistahakpur, Madeline Lucas, Lynn Steger-Strong, Vivi Ganeshananthan, Vauhini Vara. Who else? Matthew Salasis, Lydia Kiesling. There's a vast array of writers, and this is something that I've been working on for the better part of a year now, and I'm extremely excited to share it with you. I think the company is going to launch this summer. I'm kind of thinking July. That's where I think things are tracking, but there are a lot of moving parts, so don't hold me to it. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest, go to the landing page at www.deepdive.audio. You can sign up for the Deep Dive newsletter there. I will, of course, be keeping you up to speed here on this show as well. But How to Write a Novel, hosted by me and featuring dozens of writers offering their perspectives on the art of writing fiction. It's coming your way soon, so stay tuned. Oh, and you can also follow Deep Dive on Instagram and Bluesky. So my guest today, once again, is Katie Kitamura. Her new novel is called Audition, and it's available from Riverhead Books. Katie Kitamura's previous novels include A Separation and Intimacies. Intimacies was longlisted for the National Book Award and the Penn Faulkner Award, and it was a finalist for the Joyce Carol Oates Prize. Katie is a recipient of the Rome Prize in Literature, and her work has been translated into 21 languages. She teaches in the creative writing program at NYU, and I'm so pleased to welcome her onto the Otherppl show for the first time. So let's get to the conversation. Here I am with Katie Kitamura.
I mean, I started thinking about this novel shortly after I published a book. It must have been in 2017, A Separation. And I was trying to decide what I would do next. And I had the initial kind of, I wouldn't go so far as to say idea, but I had this kind of inkling of a constellation of themes and a premise that I was interested in, primarily because I'd come across this headline in the New York Times, in fact, that read, "A stranger told me he was my son." And that really provoked something inside of me. I didn't read the article because I already had this strong sense at that point that I wanted to write a novel stemming from that idea. And I was interested less in the narrative explanation for that headline and more in the contradiction between stranger and son, and the idea that those were two things that felt almost mutually exclusive. But I couldn't quite figure my way into the material, and so I set that aside and I wrote another book that ended up a book called Intimacies, which I published in 2021. And then after I finished Intimacies, I came back to this book. I was actually going for a walk with a friend has a son who's quite a bit older than mine. And when I recited the sentence to her, she said, well, that's just a description of motherhood. Every time my son comes home from college, it's like a stranger has walked into the house. And I think that was a moment when I had a pretty strong sense of what I wanted to do, which was to write a book about certain universal experiences of parenthood, of marriage, of making art, of falling in love, that had within them contradictory and even mutually exclusive elements. So that was when the idea came. And in general, I would say it's almost like a leapfrog with me. I have an idea for a book and then I write another book and then I come back to that idea. So I would say in general, I'm sitting with an idea for as long as 6 years, maybe in total.
So I'm curious, just at the level of craft and the actual creative process of writing a novel, like when you sit with an idea for a novel for many years, what does that actually look like psychologically and internally? Are you working out plot, or is it just kind of marinating in your subconscious? What has to happen in order for you to be ready to write? What had to happen for Audition?
So I love that question. For me, it's much less active than it might be for other writers. I think I know I'm ready to write when I start to kind of gather materials in a way, when I start to research actively, when I start to read around an idea. And I'm not always reading for books that are about the same subject matter, but more reading for kind of tone or a sensibility that I want to try to create in the book. But it is quite slow. And for a long time, it is just marinating somewhere in my brain, as you put it. And, I think so much of writing a novel is waiting for an idea to acquire the layers, including the kind of subconscious layers that are necessary to give it the right kind of depth. So I am happy to let my mind grapple with it without consciously thinking about an idea. I'm never outlining. I'm never even taking notes. I don't really take that many notes when I write a novel. And the more books I've written, the fewer notes there are. It's really a process of discovery on the page. But I think I finish a book and I usually turn around and start writing the next book almost immediately. So some of it is just scheduling. Some of it is just, I'm done with one book, and so now it's time to start the next one. And I have something in reserve that I've been thinking about for an extended period of time.
Do you talk about it? I mean, I think you mentioned you were kind of talking with a friend, but is this something you need to verbalize, or is it something you sort of keep close to the vest?
Usually I don't talk about it very much. I mean, I'm married to a novelist, Hari Kunzru, and we don't even talk that much about the books that we're writing. So for a period of several years, we are not discussing the thing we're working on for many hours during each day. And then we exchange drafts when we have complete drafts. And then that is really the moment when I see what Hari has been thinking about for many years. I look, for example, the novel he's writing right now. I don't know the premise. I don't really know the constellation of themes. I have no idea. I have no idea what he's doing in his office every day, but it's a very, very exciting moment when I can come across the book that he's produced and the book that he's been living with for some time. I think I have lately become a little bit looser in my writing process, and I have started to talk about it with just a handful of people. And I think in part this was because with my last book, with Intimacies, I made a very conscious effort to share a draft with my agent and editors before it was actually completely done, which is something I never done before. And I did that because I had the sense that the books were becoming very polished in a way before I opened them up for feedback. And I had this very clear sense that some of the problems of the book were very much baked into the project and they really couldn't be changed. The issues were very, very ossified and they were difficult to extract and fix. So I thought with Intimacies, I would share it a bit earlier and get a sense of what people thought were potential questions that they had about the book and have the opportunity to address them earlier on in the process. And so because of that, I have started talking a little bit more about my work as it's in progress.
I read too that you read a lot of plays.
I do. I read plays actually as a kind of warm-up. I tend to read them before I start writing. So I'm very rarely reading them during the actual writing process, but I read them almost as a palate cleanser before I start a novel. And it's usually the same two playwrights. It's usually Ibsen and Pinter. And there's something about the menace in Pinter and something about the situational dynamics in Ibsen that are really useful for me when I start to write. And I like to have it kind of fresh in my mind before I start working. And then I let it drift away because to a certain extent, I think I don't want to be living too much with another person's work as I'm writing. So I do read and I do continue to think about a lot of different people's work every time I write a book, but I try not to be too much in the thrall of a single person's work.
Well, it reminds me of conversations I've had with writers on this show in the past, talking about how reading poetry can be like a kind of elixir, or it can help to get them generative, something about reading poetry, like reading in a different realm can be useful. But I haven't heard too many people say that they read plays, and I'm curious to know what it is about that form that might be helpful. I can imagine it's because it's pared away. There's more space. It kind of, works on maybe a different part of the brain slightly than fiction might, or.
I mean, I think that's a really good point. I know a lot of friends who read poetry as well while they're writing, and there's something about reading in a different form to your own that is, or to the project that you're working on, that is definitely useful. And I think with poetry, obviously, it gives you an attunement to the use of language that is going to be useful when you're writing fiction. I think for me, with plays, I've always been really interested in writing set pieces. And to some extent, maybe less with this book, but certainly with the last book, it is in a way a series of set pieces where you are going into a scene and you're kind of digging around in a single setting, a single location, a relatively static set of characters and seeing what you can make with it. And that's something that a writer I really admire, Javier Marias, does again and again and again. He stages these extraordinary set pieces. There's one in, I think, the second volume of Your Face Tomorrow, which is a trilogy that he wrote, that is in a nightclub, and it just goes on, it goes on for, I mean, I think 80 pages or something like this. And it's an extraordinary piece of writing. And he's not really going into other timelines within that scene, as I recall, although it's been a minute since I've read it, but he's really staying in scene with these characters. And then something extraordinary does happen in the nightclub, but it's a kind of patient unfolding of scene work that I really admire. And it is something that I would love to be able to do in my own work. And I think something about theater, there is a lot of open space. You're absolutely right. There's a lot of kind of circulation that happens, a lot of blank space in a play. But I think it's also the fact that it is quite restricted. You are working with a handful of characters. You're generally working with a handful of settings. And that is something that is useful to me to think about in all my fiction. Of course, it was especially useful for this novel.
Which I guess we could call a pandemic novel. Like Audition was written during the Biden administration, like that kind of, I mean, the pandemic was already underway when he took office, but that's when it was begun and that's when it was drafted, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I remember when I started writing the novel, I thought, well, I'm definitely not writing a pandemic novel. I wasn't interested in writing, about a virus or about vaccines or about protocols or about masks. And none of that appears in the novel at all. But the one thing that does appear in the novel that to me does make it a pandemic novel in a way is in the second half of the novel, it's really about family members coming home and living together in a small apartment and struggling with the reconstitution of their family dynamic. And that seems to me something that many people experienced during the pandemic. So in that sense, I think I inadvertently did write a novel about the pandemic in a way, although I really didn't realize that until I started talking about the book over the last month or so. That was not something that occurred to me in the writing or in the editing or even in the run-up to the publication of the book. It's just something that has become a little bit clearer to me since. I mean, one thing I would say is that I think as a writer, you're always writing from the context you're in, and it's inescapable. You're breathing the air that you're breathing, and it finds its way onto that page, in the sense that I think the vast majority of novels being written now will have something to do in some way with the climate emergency, because that is the situation we're living in. There'll be some that are very directly about climate change. There'll be others where it's a question of atmosphere, maybe a question of the way characters make their decisions. But I think you can't help but draw from and reflect the social context in which you're living when you're writing a book.
This is also, I believe, the first novel that you've written that is set in the United States.
That's correct. I've written mostly things that are set outside of the United States. And I think particularly in the last two books, in Intimacies and A Separation, there was something about, they weren't simply set outside of the United States. They were books where a character was newly arrived in a location and was trying to understand the kind of social rules that organize a place. And that was very useful for me. I wanted to write characters who had an almost anthropological attention to detail, to how people behaved, to deciphering their mannerisms, their way of speaking. And I also wanted to write characters who were in some way alienated from where they were, who didn't necessarily feel at home. I think with this novel, that sense of alienation is so internal and in a lot of ways is manifest directly in the structure of the book. And so for that reason, it felt comfortable setting it in a location that's not only very familiar to me, but is also familiar to the character. And maybe that's even the more important point. She is somebody who's lived in New York for a very long time. And so that hyper attunement to location that I think I was interested in writing in Intimacies and A Separation did not feel front of mind in this book in quite the same way. Although in a lot of ways, I do think it feels like a New York novel.
It's a novel about an actress.
Yes.
And I'm curious to know like what the research process might have looked like for you to like inhabit that kind of character authentically. Did you like talk to actors? Do you know? I'm imagining if you live in New York and you run around in art circles, you probably know some actors.
I know quite a few actors. I do. You know, the last book, so Intimacies is set in a war crimes tribunal that's loosely modeled on the International Criminal Court. And that was a very research heavy book. It involved interviewing simultaneous interpreters and reading a lot of transcripts of trials and researching quite deeply into the situation of one particular trial, which is kind of in the backdrop of the novel. This was a novel that required very little research. When I first moved to New York, I had a lot of friends who were both playwrights and actors, and they were largely performing in off-Broadway productions. And it was a very wonderful and quite loose time in my life. It was a period when I felt I had a lot of leisure. I had a lot of time. So I would go and sit in on rehearsals for hours, which is something that would be more difficult for me now, I think. Or if I did it, I would be more consciously doing it as a form of research. But it was something that was just part of spending time with my friends and understanding the work they were making. And I learned a lot, and I probably picked up more or less everything I needed to write the book. I did have a couple friends read the manuscript just to double check. And then the thing I would say is that I'm mostly interested in theater insofar as I wouldn't say mostly, but I'm interested in part in theater insofar as it allows me to think about writing in general and writing as it applies to myself. So a lot of the things that the character says about performance and about acting and about the world of theater is to some extent, I think, me as a novelist unpicking what I think about fiction.
So this is the third book in a trilogy, right?
That's right.
And each of these books features an unnamed female protagonist.
Yes.
I'm curious as to why, like no name. Like, can you talk about that choice?
Of course. So with the first two books, the characters don't have names, in part because they're very much in between. They're characters who are not firmly pinned to a particular social position or structure. So in A Separation, the character is separated from her husband, but not yet fully divorced from him. She's both married to him, but not married to him. In Intimacies, the character is in The Hague on a provisional contract. She doesn't know how long she'll be there. She doesn't know if this is a permanent move or merely temporary, the extent to which she should be trying to find a home there. And I think I'm interested in characters who are deracinated in some way. And names give a lot of information. Names, whether we like it or not, names can tell you a great deal about the character and their background. And they also fix you within a system. And I wanted my characters to in some way be free floating outside of that system. You know, they don't have a fixed identity. They don't have a fixed position. And names are also a source of power, both a way of exerting power. If you just think about how patriarchy works, for example, in the way names are passed down, but it's a little bit double-edged. On the one hand, they're not fixed into the system, but they're also free of the system in some way. And that's a dynamic that I was interested in exploring. With this character, she could have had a name, to be honest. It might have made sense for her to have a name. She's a well-known actor. She's somebody whose name has meaning beyond the private sphere. But I think I wanted to kind of round out the book in some way, and it came quite naturally to me to write her without a name. I mean, the 3 books to me function as a trilogy in part because of the similarity in the unnamed female narrators, but also because they're all books that are playing with ideas of interpretation. In A Separation, the central character is a translator. In Intimacies, she's a simultaneous interpreter. And in this book, Audition, she's an actor. I was interested in female characters who speak the words of other people and what it means to speak the words that have been authored by another person, both the way that your body absorbs those words by enunciating them, and also the way that by speaking these words, you also transform them in some way.
Yeah, it's interesting. In prepping for this conversation, I was reading interviews and reviews and so on, and I saw the book described and this trilogy described in various ways, some of which mirror what you just said. I think there was a New York Times review that called it her most thrilling examination yet of the deceit inherent in human connection. And then I've also seen it described as a trilogy about, as you just said, interpretation, but also passivity. And I think you alluded to passivity in what you just said, but that's another theme that's big for you, right?
It is. I mean, I'm fascinated by the narrative preoccupation with agency. I teach creative writing on an MFA program at New York University, and I have really wonderful students from whom I've learned a lot. And one thing that I did notice, though, is in workshop, which is the course that I teach, if there's a character who they felt was too passive, they would often say, this character doesn't have any agency. This character needs to have agency for the story to work. And I always found that interesting. Why do we think a character needs to have agency for a story to feel true? Because, of course, the reality is that very few of us have very much agency at all. And I think nobody has total agency. But what we do have is the fantasy of agency, and we live under the illusion that we have a great deal of choice and a great deal of control over the way our lives unfold. That's not really the case. I think that's a narrative that is useful and helps people to remain in their place, so to speak. So I'm always actually interested in characters who can see beyond that a little bit and who understand their passivity, but who are also kind of exploring the edges of that passivity, the places where that passivity shades into action. And I think I'm interested in that for 2 reasons. One is because I simply think it's just a closer reflection to how most people exist in the world. And the second is because I think it acts in opposition to some of the tropes of fiction, which rely so much on this idea of agency. So when my students are saying that a character should have agency, I think they're saying that because that is how the vast majority of fiction works. You know, it works on the premise that a character activates a scene, activates a narrative, is a driver of action in some way. And I'm always interested in seeing if there are different ways of finding sources for how a narrative might unfold.
So this is also a book, and I think a trilogy, that is interested in the instability of the self. And like, this is something that I'm really interested in. Like, what is a self? What does that mean? Your novel is called Audition. And so that title to me implies that there is some degree of performance that we undertake in all of our various social roles, including familial roles. And I'm just curious to know if like an interest in like this instability of self is really explicit for you, or is it just something that kind of is an outgrowth of these other concerns, the interpretation and passivity?
No, it's something I'm really interested in. I'm very interested in performance, as you noted, and that's something that is in all 3 of the books. And I'm interested in the way performance can actually shape identity and selfhood in some way. I think we often think of performance as something that's inherently artificial, but my sense is very much that performance can shape identity in a really critical way, and it's part of what allows us to be functioning human beings in society. I see it with my children. They're 8 and 12, and they're reaching a kind of age where you can see them kind of cycling through different versions of being. They're trying on different identities, and they're trying to see what fits. And that is part of a very natural and very healthy exploration of selfhood, through which they will eventually arrive at something that feels more stable. But beneath that stability is that instability. And I'm interested in characters who can kind of see those cracks. I always think, for me as a writer, I'm less interested in when a character is behaving in character, and I'm much more interested when a character is behaving out of character. When the idea of who they are, the story that they tell themselves about who they are, starts to falter. That's always a place as a novelist where I'm always trying to press a bit harder, where I'm always trying to kind of get into that crack and force it open and see what's there. So I think of performance very much as something that shapes selfhood in a useful way, but counter to that is always a kind of threat of what happens when you see the performance for what it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's like something that I think I'm aware of peripherally, usually. Every once in a while, I'll think about it like, wow, we're really just performing for each other. Like, I'm in the pickup line at school to get my kids, and I've got to act like now I'm playing the part of the good dad. And then, my daughter will get in the car, and then I'll shift into like some other role where I'm the father. And I think it's particularly interesting and maybe a little bit unsettling to think of the ways that we're actually performing, even in a family context. Like, I think a lot of us like to think of our home and our family as like the place where we can kind of like drop the mask. And to some degree, that's true. But there is some role playing that you get into, or like where you're behaving in a way that adheres to some idea of who you think you are or think you should be. That's what your book kind of got me thinking about. And I think probably this trilogy, in the aggregate, makes people think about.
I mean, for me, this is in a lot of ways a book about parenthood. And I absolutely agree. I think it's especially in the early stages of parenting, but maybe throughout, there is so much role play that is involved. I mean, there was for me, at least. I didn't know what I was doing at all. I was trying to understand what it meant to be a parent. And for sure, I was relying on the scripts that are so readily available everywhere around us, right? There's so many narratives, there's so much policing of behavior when it comes to parenting. And I think it's inevitable that you draw from them. And I think that's, we're figuring out what it means to take on this other identity, which is something that is different to who we were before. But I'm very struck by it. I'm struck by how I kind of cycle through different roles every day, really without even thinking about it. If I'm talking to my husband, I'm speaking in a certain way, and then my kid walks in, and I feel like my entire voice and demeanor changes. Certainly my vocabulary changes. All these things that are quite telling. We do it every single day without even thinking about it. And that's of course completely normal and healthy. But it is striking to me because, as you say, we think of family life as a relationship you have with your child, with your partner, as being amongst the most intimate and authentic that are available, but they're very much conditioned by models of behavior that are external. Do I think that compromises the nature of my family relationships? Not really. It's a little bit like what I said before. I think those models of behavior, which do regulate and control and surveil people in so many ways, but at the same time, they allow us to fumble towards a way of being with each other that I think is well, if not healthy, is certainly inevitable.
Yeah, I don't know what we would do in the absence of those models, right? Like, what would I be doing? And a question that occurs to me is like, yeah, like it seems like what we're saying is that there are selves, plural.
Yes.
And then I start to think, well, who's the real me? Like, is there an essential me, or is that just empty? You know what I'm saying? Like, maybe all of the selves in combination are somehow me, or maybe some are truer than others. Like, these are the kinds of questions that arise.
I mean, I was thinking about, I saw the psychoanalyst and writer Darian Leader give a talk, and somebody said, what is the point of psychoanalysis if it doesn't fix you, if it doesn't make you better? And he said, the point is that it allows you to see. And I think that's so much kind of what I think the point of fiction is. And I think if it's something that allows you to see, I don't want to say the reality, because obviously there's so many different ways of thinking about it. But if you see that we all do have these slightly irreconcilable versions of ourselves that we live with, multiple at a time, then, and you can sustain that and still kind of like move through the world, then I think that's a kind of an interesting way of being.
So this book I have seen described as well, maybe even by you, as a kind of Rorschach blot. There's something cubist about it. The husband character, Tomas, who we have not mentioned, I don't think yet, is an art critic who is working on an essay about Czech cubism. So this kind of speaks to what we're saying, like the ways in which, you know, reality is kind of mutable. Identity can be mutable. The way that we perceive things can shift depending on the time we're in, the context, all of this stuff. I'm not an expert on cubism, but it's like the face is all kind of looking mangled, but it's taking into account the fourth dimension, I think, if like my art history education is sufficient. But I don't know, that just all feels kind of a piece, like those creative choices, like that Tomas is an art critic, that he's interested in cubism.
Yeah.
And then this kind of way in which your novel invites the reader to really do the work of interpretation on his or her own. To a degree, I mean, that's always the case with a work of art, but I think maybe to a concentrated degree with this novel, you're asking the reader to make choices.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a book that has, I would say, maybe two very clear interpretations, I think, that are contradictory, and a couple of others as well, I hope, that are in there. And it's a book that I wanted to be open to interpretation, and I wanted to be filled in by the reader. I really didn't want it to be a book where there is one solution that I, the author, knew. And that if you couldn't arrive at that solution in some way, you hadn't understood the book. Because that's not my experience of reading at all. I did a doctorate in American literature, and I was primarily looking at the work of people who are no longer living. And I probably was not a very good academic, and I did not bother myself overly much with authorial intention. I was thinking primarily about what I thought the text was doing. And that was really a kind of wonderful way to relate to a book, to be freed of thinking about what the author thought they were doing, and to think about what I thought the text was doing. And that's a little bit, I think, the spirit in which this book was written. To some extent, it doesn't matter what I think the book is about or what I think the book is doing. What really matters is what the reader thinks the text is doing. And there's a wonderful, I was interviewing a wonderful writer called Yasmin Zaher, who wrote this debut novel called The Coin, which came out last year. And she said something about the subconscious, not of her, but of the book. And she said, there's a lot in the subconscious of The Coin that I don't really know about. And I thought that was such a wonderful way of thinking about a text. And I do think that when a novel is very good, as The Coin is, there are things the book is doing that maybe the writer is not fully in control of. And the writer, the French novelist Ariel Letellier, who's a member of the Oulipo group, in his novel The Anomaly, he has this wonderful line, which is spoken by a kind of mid-list middle-aged, struggling novelist for whom writing fiction has kind of destroyed his personal life. And he thinks, why do I keep writing? And he says he keeps writing because if he were to write one sentence that was more intelligent than he was, that miracle will be enough to make a writer of him. And I think about that a lot because I think that's why I'm writing. And I think that's why the vast majority of people are writing is a hope that something happens on the page that surpasses your conscious control. So a lot of this book was about ceding control. It was about trying to write something that the reader could kind of pick up and read in multiple ways.
So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about you.
Okay.
I'm always interested when I talk to writers to hear about their kind of formation as artists, how it happened. And I read that you're a California girl. You were born in Sacramento. Is that right?
I was born in Sacramento and I was brought up in Davis, which is about 30 miles west. Is that the direction? South? 30 miles from Sacramento anyway.
I'd have to look at a map. Yeah. I'm like, I have to place Davis, but I'm interested. Like, I think your father was an academic at UC Davis?
That's right.
But do you have, can you trace any kind of creative lineage or artistic lineage in your family? Like, do you know where it comes from?
It's interesting. My brother's a tattoo artist and I'm a novelist. So we're both kind of working in a creative field. My father was a civil engineer. So he was not doing anything that was, I guess, strictly defined as creative, although I think there's a lot in research that is very, very creative. I would say there's something obviously in the family, in the upbringing that allowed both my brother and I to take what feel like risks. I'm second generation. My brother's first generation. He moved to this country when he was, I think, 2 or 3. And it's not necessarily the most obvious route, particularly as the children of Asian immigrants, Japanese immigrants. But they always made it seem possible and they were very supportive. And they were parents who said, as long as it's going to make you happy, then we'll support you in that decision. So we were very, very lucky.
Have you ever let your brother give you a tattoo?
I don't have any tattoos. He wanted me to tattoo him because I think he's at a stage in his tattoo collecting where the most significant thing is not the quality of the image, it's who the tattoo comes from. But I was so nervous that I think I actually made him nervous in turn. So the offer was rescinded.
Yeah, that's a lot though. If you don't know what you're doing,
I don't know what I'm doing. And I can't, he's as you have to be in order to be a tattoo artist. He's an excellent illustrator. He's very, very good at drawing. He can kind of draw anything. He can look at anything and create a likeness on the page. And I really, truly cannot. That went just to one member of the family.
So I also read that you grew up reading Agatha Christie novels.
I did.
That's interesting to me because these books I think these narratives that we really latch onto as kids, they have to be in some way central to our creative DNA if we end up writing books of our own. And I'm just interested in how you interpret that.
I absolutely grew up reading Agatha Christie. There's how many books did she write? 30 or 40? We had all of them. And I read them to the point that I would scotch tape the spines because they were falling apart. And one of the things that strikes me is that I had immense pleasure in reading those books, even when I knew the solution. And so I think some part of me from an early age understood the pleasure of reading as being in some way divorced from plot, despite the fact that those books are very, very heavily plotted. But I had real pleasure in the mechanism, even when I knew the outcome. That kind of suspense was not critical to the pleasure of reading. I mean, I can see the influence quite directly. I've written a lot of novels that play with mystery as a trope. My novel, A Separation, is in some ways a murder mystery. But they're all books that kind of set up a genre structure and then walk away from it in some way. And that is probably to do with the way that I consume those books, because I came to them for the mystery, but then I stayed for something else that was not to do with the solution. I think the other thing I realized relatively recently is I'm not a writer who's interested in backstory. And I don't really write backstory for my characters. And of course, so many of the Agatha Christie iconic characters do not have backstory. We don't know what the backstory of Miss Marple is. We don't know what the backstory of Hercule Poirot is. In a way, when something from their past is revealed, it feels very, very shocking. It feels like a real reveal in some way, like a plot twist, to know something about something that had happened to these characters in their past. And that's a little bit how I write my own characters. So I imagine some of that comes from that very early childhood reading.
So what kind of kid were you? It sounds like you were bookish and happy-ish.
I think I was bookish and happy. You know, I read pretty young and all the time, incessantly. I was one of those kids who would walk reading a book, and my parents didn't allow books at the dinner table, and I used to hide them under the table and try to read through dinner. I was really addicted to reading. And I think one of the things that addiction gave me was a sense of privacy, you know, which you don't have that much of as a child, especially now. Everything feels very, you know, your parents know everything you're doing in the early years of your childhood, but privacy is very important for everyone, but especially for children. And I found that privacy through reading. I imagine that it's in search of that privacy that so many kids now turn to, you know, the internet and all these forums and whatever. I actually don't even know what they're doing, but you know, that kind of space, you know, where they can be somebody else, that feels like a very natural instinct, where they can do something, that they can live in an imaginative space that their parents or their teachers don't know about. And in a funny way, I think actually reading gives you that same space. And that's space that I had access to from a very, very early age. You know, my parents just never restricted my reading in any way. I was allowed to read whatever I want, and they would always get as many books as I needed, whether it's from the library, from the bookshop. There was just never any sense in which I couldn't read as freely and as much as I wanted.
That's lovely. And is there anything else, like when you think back on your life and you consider the work that you're doing now as an author, like, are there formative experiences or moments that you feel like were really pivotal?
I don't know about moments. I mean, I danced a lot through my childhood and adolescence, and I studied music. And I think those two things must be very important to the life that I have right now. I think writing and dancing and music are very, very different. They all require a lot of discipline and commitment. And there is a certain way in which, whether you're studying ballet or classical music or you're writing, there's a lot of just, you keep doing it even when it's not working, and you just keep going over and over again until some small incremental progress is made. I suppose the one thing that I feel about music and dance is that it is collective in some way, and it's very much collective in the moment of its execution. And writing is very different. I'm not a writer who takes pleasure from my own work. I mean, you know, the kind of euphoria of performance, of playing music or of dancing, that has never been anything that I have experienced in relation to either writing my own work or reading my own work. I get it from reading other people's work. I do. But the act of making work feels very, very, very different to the act of dancing or making music. I don't know if other writers have, or do other writers find it different?
I think there's like a way in which working in different art forms is beneficial. I don't see how it couldn't be, like they speak to one another.
Yes.
And I get like, even just if it were only the discipline that it takes to be a ballerina, that's what you were, right? You studied ballet?
Yeah, I studied ballet, yeah.
Like that's a punishing, I saw Black Swan. I know what that's all about. That's a punishing art form. You have to really be tough physically to do that. And if that were the only thing you learned, like if you took from ballet that discipline and that willingness to kind of persevere through physical pain and through like physical exhaustion, all that stuff, that alone, I think, could be very helpful to somebody who's trying to write a novel, because it's different. It's maybe not as physically painful, but it's emotionally painful. And you need to have a sense of commitment and a sense of, I'm just going to keep going, even when it's not working, and make that incremental progress, as you said.
I mean, I suppose the other thing, listening to you speak, is that it's really useful to understand how other art forms work when you're a novelist. And when I feel stuck in a project, for me, the solutions are not in other books. I don't read, I don't turn to my bookshelves to find the solution when I feel stuck in a novel. I almost always turn to other art forms and try to find a path through the trouble from those art forms. And I think, having studied dance and music, and I worked on documentaries when I was in my 20s, I think that one thing that is useful is I have a sense of how, when you're working in another medium, you might approach a problem. And this is really not the same as the tools that you might conventionally use with fiction.
So you didn't start writing seriously until you were in your 20s?
No, never. I didn't even try. I was really, and I would say that even now I spend many more hours of my life reading than I do writing. And I think of myself as a reader primarily. I think I'm a good reader. I think I've become a better reader. I think it's interesting. I started reading in a very, I did a PhD, so I read in a very academic way. And then now I teach creative writing. So I have learned to read in a different way. I read work in progress, and I understand reading as a very profoundly empathetic act, because when I'm teaching, what I'm trying to do is to perceive the book that the writer is trying to write and help them find their way towards that book. And oftentimes, when you're in the early stages of working on something, you don't know exactly what it is you're trying to make. And so when I think about teaching workshop, I'm thinking about getting into the headspace of the writer and helping them to see what they're making. And that in turn, I think, has made me a more generous and more open reader. So I feel like when I look, back on the past decade, I think the strides I've made have really been, I think I've become a better reader, even more than I've become a better writer.
I'm curious though, when it comes to reading, obviously you're reading as a professor, you're reading the work of your students, but when it comes to like reading for pleasure, and this gets a little bit tricky because as writers, like all reading is in some way work related, I think. But do you carve out specific time? Like, do you have rituals tied to reading? Because I think a lot of writers, myself included, sometimes that stuff can get difficult to manage, and you can get the feeling that you're not reading enough.
Yeah. I mean, I did an event the other day and somebody said, how do you think about, the finite number of books that you have left to write? And I thought, I never think about my mortality in terms of how many books I have left to write. I think about it always in terms of how many books I have left to read. And it is not a huge number. If I'm lucky, if I'm reading regularly, I'm reading maybe 2 books a week, which is 100 books a year. And I don't want to do the math, but it's not, it's limited, the number of books that we all have left to read. It's interesting. I have so many piles of books by my bed, and they're all organized according to, as you described, the kind of tension between duty and pleasure. You know, I had the books that I have to read for, you know, I don't know if it's a blurb request or if it's an event or if it's a prize or, you know, whatever it is. There's like always a stack of books that I'm always late on reading. There's a books that I am reading because they pertain to a novel that I'm researching or starting to think about writing. And then there's just the kind of pile of books that are things I'm curious about. And then I'm always pulling from that third pile all the time because it feels a little bit delinquent. And there's so much pleasure in reading something that doesn't have any utility. I think, you know, when you're reading for work, when you're reading in relation to a project, it does feel different to me. Even when it's a great writer, even when it's a writer whose work I admire tremendously and would in any other context be reading solely for pleasure. Once I'm reading it in relation to a project, the tenor of the reading changes slightly. So I try to cycle through pretty regularly. I also try to read one old book and then one contemporary book because I think otherwise I would just be reading only contemporary fiction. So that is something else that I do. I try to read something that has been written, you know, before 1950, say, and balance out my reading in that way.
So as a girl who grew up reading Agatha Christie, do you still read like detective fiction and stuff like that?
I mean, I'm reading a lot of Graham Greene at the moment, which that's thrillers rather than, but kind of a cousin, I think, because I want to write something now that I think is thriller adjacent, although I'll be the only person who thinks of it that way. I haven't read an Agatha Christie novel in decades, and I'd be very curious to see what it feels like to revisit those stories because I remember the plots perfectly. I remember exactly who did what and why and when. But I mean, I like Manchette. I read some Simenon. I like Le Carré a lot. I think he's a great writer. So to some extent, but not any more than any other genre. Although, hang on, having said that, I love Patrick Modiano and that those are detective novels in so many ways.
Do you think you would ever write one?
A detective novel? Like an actual detective novel?
Yeah, I mean...
with a solution? I mean, never say never. It would be fun. Yeah, it would be fun. I don't know if I will, but I mean, I'm definitely interested.
So I always close by asking my guest, like, you know, you just mentioned it, you're working on something that is thriller adjacent. Mm-hmm. Does that have its own shelf at the bookstore, the thriller adjacent category? I feel like it maybe should, but
I think it maybe should. I mean, I would put Modiano in that category. I would put some of Marguerite Duras in that category as well. Who else could go in there?
Oh God. Lots of people.
Lots of people.
But I won't ask you to like synopsize. I know you're probably not even there yet, but I'm just curious, like, can you give any clues or hints as to like what, if not what the book is about or what happens in it, like what maybe some of your concerns are? Because as we mentioned earlier, Audition is the end of a trilogy. And so I would imagine you've kind of closed the door on some of the thematic concerns that you were grappling with in that trilogy and are turning to something different and new. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Yes. Although my editor said the other day, she said, you better not write a fourth one because you've gone and told everybody it's a trilogy, which is true. It is interested in, I think, the image of American power abroad is what I think I'm interested in. And obviously that's really in some ways tricky to write because it's undergoing such a rapid evolution, but at the same time that's been in play for many, many years. So that is a small component of it. And I think to a certain extent is maybe structurally or tonally close to Intimacies, and in that sense, in that novel was interested in looking at institutions, global power and how they function. But it would be, that narrative would be in the backdrop, in the sense that it's in the backdrop at Intimacy. So that's one theme that I'm interested in. It's set in Italy, and that's it. That's all I've got.
I think there's going to need to be there's going to be multiple research trips, right? You're going to have to go to Italy.
So. Maybe a wholesale move.
I was going to, yeah. You're going to have to go. But, it's interesting. You said that the perception of American power, like globally, is undergoing a rapid evolution. It's very strange interviewing or just talking to people in this kind of formal way about their work and a little bit about their lives. And meanwhile, there's all this chaos and, at least from my perspective, darkness that's sort of infiltrating this country right now. It's a very unstable time, and it's the backdrop to all of our lives. And yet, like, I'm getting up in the morning and the kids are going to school, and I'm talking to writers and doing this show and trying to do my work. And I know that you're doing the same. But, like, how are you managing? I feel like we should all talk about this more. I certainly need it. Yeah. Like, how are you doing with all this?
I mean, it was interesting because in the first Trump administration, I remember the day after the election, it was every email you sent would kind of say, how are you? Are you okay? And that did not happen this time in my email inbox. People didn't refer to it. And I feel like the response is, even though it's much, much worse than the first time round, I think there's a way in which people feel like that they have to get on with their lives. I mean, Intimacies for me was really a book that was written during the first Trump administration. And it was a novel about the cognitive dissonance of living in a time of real political and historical turmoil. And still, as you said, having to get your kids to school and having to make their sandwiches and having to think about whether or not, you paid your electricity bill, and the kind of discord between the profoundly banal and the profoundly disturbing that we all live with. That was something that was really very much front of mind when I was writing that novel, which is, it's set in a war crimes tribunal where somebody is on trial for genocide. And the central character has this sense that she's living inside of narratives of historical significance, and at the same time having all of those small scale concerns that you just listed, and that it is a very strange dissonance to be living with. And I think my feeling, which is in some ways maybe related to something that I tried to express earlier, but very badly, but which is my sense that what's actually important is to acknowledge that dissonance and to live with that dissonance, to say that what is happening is unacceptable, and to not let it become normalized in some way in your psyche, even as you acknowledge that at the same time you have to get on, quote unquote, with your life. I think living with that irreconcilability, that discord inside of you is in some ways part of the work of existing in these times in a way that's both functioning and also conscious.
That's well said. And I know you have to go, so I'm going to close here. It's been an absolute delight to meet you and to talk with you. Congratulations on Audition. And I wish you well with the next book. And I wish you well as we all kind of like navigate whatever is to come.
Thank you, Brad. This has been such a pleasure.
All right, there we go. That's today's episode. My conversation with Katie Kitamura about her new novel, Audition, available now from Riverhead Books. You can find out more about Katie and her work over at katiekitamura.com. and follow her on social media. I believe she's on Instagram. There might be a Facebook page. There was a Twitter. I don't know what the status is, but check it out, katiekitamura.com. And again, the new novel is Audition. It's out there. waiting for you. Go get your copy right away. Don't forget to subscribe to the Otherppl podcast wherever you get your shows. You can also subscribe on YouTube, and you can follow me on Bluesky and Instagram. Sign up for my newsletter over at Substack. And if you like this show, if you listen regularly, if you get something from it, if you feel it adds value to your existence and your creative life, I hope you will join the Otherppl Patreon community over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Help keep this show going into the future. If you want to get an Otherppl t-shirt or a sweatshirt, or if you want to sign up for the Otherppl book club, all of that can be done over at the show's official website, otherppl.com. And be sure to check out my new company. It's called Deep Dive. The website is www.deepdive.audio. Follow Deep Dive on Bluesky and Instagram. And it should be launching in the not-too-distant future, so stay tuned. If you have 2 minutes and you want to help me out, I would really appreciate it if you would rate and review this show wherever you listen. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. Rate it. If you can write a little review, that's great. It helps the show in the algorithm. It helps it find new listeners. All right, so coming up on Sunday, there should be a new character studies episode. It's in the works. It's not official quite yet, but I think it's going to happen. It's one of those. I'm flying by the seat of my pants here. I'm trying to make it all happen. So, a new character studies episode coming your way, I think, on Sunday.